Hello and welcome to the two-part video lesson on Virginia Woolf's highly popular modern novel, To the Lighthouse. So we'll look at a bit about the author herself and her writing style before we get into the summary plotline, key characters, and some of the important themes as well. So let's get started. Virginia Woolf was a 20th century modern novelist born in 1882 to a distinguished literary family. Her father, Leslie Stephen, was a man of letters and the author of many great critical and philosophical essays, so one could say her father's literary taste had a great deal of impact and influence on her mind. Also, they had distinguished literary personalities at the social gatherings they held at their home, which richly infused the artistic spirit within her. The death of her mother when Virginia was 13 was the first blow to her mind. It was the first of the losses that affected her deeply. And it then started the mental struggle which she suffered throughout her life. During that century, many of the young men and friends of the family were studying in Cambridge, but Virginia's health didn't permit her to take the conventional schooling. So basically, she studied and got most of the education at home from her father's study. After her father's death, Virginia moved to Bloomsbury Square, where she started and founded a Bloomsbury Group, a literary club, of which she was also a very keen member, and then she married Leonard Woolf, who was also one of the distinct literary figures of that society. After marriage, both lived at Hogarth Press, where Leonard helped her publishing most of her work. Wars had strongly impacted Virginia's mental state. When the First World War broke out, it was very shattering for her sensitive soul, and during that time she suffered from constant fits of depression. And with the onset of World War II, it completely destroyed her will to live, and sadly in 1941 she committed suicide by drowning herself in the nearby river Ouse by filling her pockets with stones. So that's a bit about the author. Now let's move on to the author's writing style. Every writer is thought to be a product of the age in which he or she is born, and all the cultural, social, political environment does hold a strong influence over him or her. Since Virginia Woolf was a 20th century modern novelist, her work eventually portrays modernism in its purest form. Modernism, broadly speaking, was a movement started in the late 19th century, reaching its climax after World War I. It marks the rise of urbanization, industrialization, vice, crime, fall in the standards of sexual morality, and rapidly increasing ugliness. So for the writers of that era, it was the time to break with the past and search for new forms, to give impressions to the inner consciousness, impressions and thoughts. Also, time ceased to have a positive nature, and the modernist writers did not treat time in a usual chronological way as the former periods did. So basically, Virginia Woolf's work have been highly influenced by this movement and significantly highlighted the peculiar features of this movement. Virginia abhorred the Victorian trends in writing, that is, the 18th century conventions of well-constructed plots, well-marked characters, usual sequence of events leading to a conventional climax and denouement. Rather, she had the courage to break free from the traditional patterns to give a new direction to the English novel and formulate her own techniques of writing in novel, which includes probing into the subconscious, stream of consciousness, also called interior monologue, psychological realism, fluidity of characters, multiple point of view, time treatment, and role of central intelligence. While giving an account of the theory of her fiction, Virginia writes, "Life refuses to be contained any longer in ill-fitting vestments. Let us record the atoms as they fall upon the mind in the order they fall, however disconnected and incoherent in appearance." These words of hers highly encompass her experimental nature in bringing out the new techniques and thus in formulating the new shape of English novel. Now moving on to the quick intro to The Lighthouse. Since it's a modernist novel, it fully explores Virginia Woolf's relative new techniques in probing the inner conscious and subconscious of human mind. Therefore, it is termed as the stream of consciousness novel. It explores how humans connect with each other on the basis of their emotional maturity and how they respond to their desires and losses. Critics regard it as not only her best but also only a good novel among all others she has written. Now let's review the plot. It's quite simple because external events are quite limited. Setting is the 20th century island of Skye in Hebrides, Scotland, and since it is a modernist novel, there is more emphasis on how the events are experienced by the characters rather than a chronological order of events. The plot centers on the Ramsey family, who is spending a summer holiday in a summer house with a group of friends. The youngest of Ramsey's kids is keen to go to the lighthouse, but he couldn't. 10 years pass, during which marriages, births, and deaths are recorded in 25 pages of the novel. In the last part, the family members go to the lighthouse and the novel ends. That's it about the plot. It means it's short, nothing is much happening in terms of external events, but a lot is happening in terms of inner consciousness, emotional thoughts, and processing in the minds of characters. So before moving on to the structure and form, let's take a look at the key characters of the novel. There is Mr. Ramsey, Mrs. Ramsey, there are 8 children: Andrew, Prue, Jasper, Roger, Nancy, Rose, Cam, and James. While the friends who accompany them on this house are Lily Briscoe, Charles Tansley, Minta Doyle, Paul Riley, Augustus Carmichael, and William Banks. They're also important because they kind of strengthen the plot with their thinkings and emotional responses to the happenings around them. Let's review the main characters of the novel. Firstly, Mrs. Ramsey. It is clear that she is the central character in the novel, and it is around her that the action up to the lighthouse is moved. She is an emotional and intuitive wife, hostess, and a mother of 8 children. She basically exposes intuition and emotional truth as opposed to her husband's rational and factual truth in approach to life. So basically these two personalities are set up as a contrast to each other and derives the plot of the novel. She also holds an impeccable sense of humor and wit. She knows how to put words of kindness for her husband despite disliking his behavior. She wittily solves a quarrel between her children, and sometimes she is irritated by a few of the guests around her house, but she takes care of not provoking them. Mrs. Ramsey also acts as a unifying force in the novel. She becomes structurally and psychologically a cohesive force and thus works as a source of unity within the society around her, as well as the novel on the whole. From the very opening of the novel, we find our focus fixed on Mrs. Ramsey. People start passing in and out. She remains sitting in her easy chair as a model for Lily's painting. Even though she doesn't understand the need of Lily's artistic exuberance, James, Mr. Ramsey, Charles are the first to come to Mrs. Ramsey, and they all require of some show of love and support from her, which would give them the power of living on in their life. Mrs. Ramsey has a strong influence of the persons around her. She engages herself with some of the guests during the dinner party, thus trying to talk them out of their isolation, and in this way she tries to unify them. Lily and Mr. Banks come within her vision. They hold eccentric ideas about life, but Mrs. Ramsey, with her tact and sympathy, holds the figures together. So this is the influence and impact she casts not only on her husband and children around her, but also the guests who have come to the summer house to join the family. In this way, she basically, as a strong unifying personality, holds all the figures together. Mrs. Ramsey's personality also arises as a symbol of conventional feminine principle. She becomes a thoroughly feminine symbol of fertility and fluidity, as opposed to her husband's masculine sterility and static approach to life. Because she is typically a female and womanly figure in the novel, all involved in the matchmaking efforts, she basically wants all men and women unite in fruitful relationships. And it is because of her efforts that she succeeds in getting Paul engaged to Minta. This matchmaking role is symbolic of her creative nature. So just because of her nurturing nature and her matchmaking efforts, she is considered to be a symbolic personality and figure of femininity and womanly attribute. Even though Mrs. Ramsey dies before the 3rd section of the novel starts, her womanly figure continues to hold a significant impression and presence over the character's mind in the form of her blissful memories. The house is restored in the 3rd section, only to remember the loving memories of Mrs. Ramsey. The visitors unite once again in that island resort, and in this way, her emotional personality, her emotional truth, intuitional approach towards life wins over her husband's rational and factual truth towards life. Now moving on to examine Mr. Ramsey's character, some critics deem him the villain of To the Lighthouse. In fact, most of the characters, including his own little son, James, and Lily, a friend of the family, hold him in their hatred. So as an intellectual philosopher, he exposes factual and rational approach towards life. He cannot tolerate anyone who flies in the face of facts. At the very outset of the novel, he curtly informs James about the weather not being fine enough for the internal lighthouse visit. So these are such harsh qualities that make his wife and children miserable around him. Mr. Ramsey's holding to the factual truth makes him despotic and insensitive to the sentiments of all, especially his children around him. So when we see that James' strong resentment is felt, he feels provoked enough to murder his father and calls him a sarcastic brute. This particular philosophical intellectualism in Mr. Ramsey's character enhances an aspect of stern realism in his approach towards life, and thus he becomes an egotistic despotic. As a popular philosopher, Mr. Ramsey cannot shrug off thinking about his achievements, how long would they last, how long would his philosophy be valued, and he feels himself pressurized by the haunting sense of failure, which renders him insecure and crave insatiably for sympathy from his female companions, particularly, most importantly, from his wife. So he suffers from an acute sense of his own mortality and insignificance. He fears for the failure of his own achievements. So this fear of failure within Mr. Ramsey makes him crave incessant desire for sympathy. He falls on Mrs. Ramsey's supply of love and sympathy, which keeps him satisfied with himself. So his wife acted as a mediating force, always ready to give him what he desired and smooth all emotional complications within him. Unfortunately, we have seen that Mr. Ramsey cannot get along well with any of his children, especially James. He plays the part of a jealous and domineering father in James Ramsey's Oedipal quest for Mrs. Ramsey. In the very first passage of the book, James is sitting with his mother talking about going to the lighthouse, which stands amidst the sea representing phallic symbols of male and female sexuality. Mrs. Ramsey cheers him by agreeing to his request, but Mr. Ramsey, an intellectual philosopher who understands the implication of this visit, strongly refutes Mrs. Ramsey's claims of the weather being fine. At that point, James desires to kill his father. Apparently, all this scenario enhances the theme of Oedipal complex in the novel. As the novel progresses, we see Mr. Ramsey's personality arising as a symbol of logic and rationality, which makes him a slave of time domain. He is a rich, complete character with shades of black and white. At once, he is an intellectual and tyrant, a father and a rival, and in this way, he lends a great symbolic impression on the whole novel. And also, he is set up as a great contrast to his wife, who we have discussed earlier, has been established as a very emotional, intuitive character in the novel. Along with Mr. and Mrs. Ramsey, Lily Briscoe is also one of the significant characters of the novel. She is a self-portrait who mirrors Virginia Woolf's own preoccupation with art and gender equality. She is a female artist who is shown trying to capture in paint what Woolf tried over the years to capture in words. Virginia Woolf in this self-portrait endeavors to express through Lily's trials and tribulations her views on gender-related discrimination, artistic sensibility, and creative accomplishment. Lily rebels against Mrs. Ramsey's notions of matrimony. She faces issues with male domination, which was remarkably strong in the 1920s where the novel is set up. So through her character, Virginia is trying to portray the relationship troubles. There are 4 men Lily comes in contact with, and each of them, except for Mr. Bing, tries to snub the artist in her. For this, she decides never to succumb to any man, but lives independently of all such ties. These men are Mr. Ramsey, who has an oppressive and domineering influence on her, Charles Tansley, who was an outright snob and a male chauvinist, Carmichael, and William Banks. Though William Banks has quite a different idea of love, yet Lily decides to be exempted from Mr. Ramsey's law of association that pleads her independence and that portrays her spirit of independence. So the artist and Lily prevailed over the women in her. Even after 10 years lapse in the novel, Lily is remain to be seen as the same spinster and is happy to be so. Lily is shown symbolizing the artist and her obstacles. From the very beginning, we find her experiencing difficulties while painting Mrs. Ramsey with her child and husband sitting at the window of their summer abode. These are the genuine struggles of a creative artist. To her, her brush and canvas are saviors in this world of ruin and chaos which provide her aesthetic satisfaction. But it definitely requires pangs and efforts before creative vision can be translated onto the canvas, such that we can find her still struggling for creative fulfillment even after a lapse of 10 long years. It's in the last part of the novel that when Mr. Ramsey reaches the lighthouse that Lily completes her painting. It signifies and symbolizes a triumph over the oppressive influences she has faced around her. She paints the desired portrait when she no longer feels overburdened by social hierarchy set up by the likes of Mr. Ramsey, but she only achieves this freedom when Mr. Ramsey, having reached the lighthouse, himself lets go of this fight for domination and authority. Now, coming to James Ramsey's character, Virginia Woolf employs his figure to portray the Oedipal complex effect. Through this struggle, the antagonistic attitude between James and Mr. Ramsey has been highlighted, which is all basically for one purpose, for the attainment of Mrs. Ramsey's affection. The lighthouse stands as a reminder of James' thwarted Oedipal desires. Thus, it is through the process of understanding the significance of the lighthouse for James that this underlying sexuality is observed. His hatred for his father, his desire to stay close to Mrs. Ramsey, while Mr. Ramsey's rejection to the trip of the lighthouse, which stands as a phallic symbol, all has been beautifully explored, through which the Oedipal complex has been established in this novel. As for Mrs. Ramsey, she understands that there is something about the lighthouse that makes both Mr. Ramsey and James upset, and she begins to comprehend the upheaving sounds of the sea surrounding the lighthouse, significant of the antagonism between father and son, which she knows is all about her possession. She somehow tries to console and keep this rift apart as best as she could, but James' jealousy and enmity for his father continues to grow, and even he never lets go of that hatred after Mrs. Ramsey dies. And one can locate it clearly in the character when we meet him again after the lapse of 10 years, reluctantly embarking on the trip to the lighthouse with his father. Also, he considers him to be his rival, Mr. Ramsey. It is finally when they reach the lighthouse that James suddenly looks at it in a very changed perspective. It was just an old bending to him now, and his father brings himself to praise James' skill, which becomes an extra push for breaking the wall between them. And as they step on the shore, it is clear that the Oedipal complex is cured and father-son bond has taken its place. So very ingeniously has Virginia developed this animosity based on Freudian complex and takes great care to incorporate it in the ending that provides further symbolic strength to this novel. So that's all from the first of this 2-part video lesson. Please do make sure to come back for the second part of this lesson. Stay tuned and thank you for listening.